Well, thank you all. Thank you all for being here on our last morning in Davos. My name is Ishaan Tharoor. I'm a foreign affairs reporter at the Washington Post. And I'm delighted to be here in conversation with Dr. Dixon Chibanda. Who here has sat on the bench outside, the friendship bench? Well, we'll be talking about that. It's a program that Dr. Chibanda started 13 years ago, correct?
Yep.
As a way of proliferating mental health solutions across Zimbabwe, and we'll be discussing that. Dr. Chibanda, of course, wears many hats. He's an ambassador for the United for Global Health Mental Health Project. He is the director of the African Mental Health Research Initiative, professor at the University of Zimbabwe, and an associate professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He's been here this week in Davos talking about mental health solutions. Mental health has been something that's been under-discussed for quite some time, but now is generating a bit of interest, attention from world leaders, sponsorship, as well as funding from major donors. So I think just before we get into the friendship bench and the work that Dr. Chibanda does, I'd love for you to set the scene in terms of, sort of widen the aperture for us a bit in terms of the state of global mental health. There are hundreds of millions of people around the world who are estimated to have depression or suffer from anxiety. Talk about the scale of this and the inadequacies of the current infrastructure to reckon with this issue, public health issue.
Thank you. So the global mental health movement has, the past 15, 20 years or so, really focused on developing interventions that can truly narrow the treatment gap for mental, neurological, and substance use disorders. Because if you look at some of the statistics, particularly based on the World Health Organization, depression alone, as an example, is the leading cause of disability globally. And every 40 seconds, someone somewhere in the world takes their lives through suicide. And if you look at the number of professionals that are meant to take care of these people who are suffering from these mental health related challenges, they just ain't enough. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa alone, or rather, let's broaden that and look at low and middle income countries in general, you're looking at a ratio of one psychiatrist to over 1.5 million of the population. It's the same for clinical psychologists. If you go to a place like New York City, where you have one psychiatrist for every 6,000 people, it seems like a better ratio. But in terms of access, there are a lot of people in New York City who do not have access to these services. And this is one of the reasons why we've also introduced a friendship bench in New York City. So mental health is a global problem. It's not a problem which is restricted to poor countries or developing countries or low and middle income countries, because it really affects people across the spectrum. So it truly is a global challenge that we're facing. It's a crisis that we're dealing with, and this is one of the reasons why this year in Davos, we're saying it's time to act. And the reason why we're saying it's time to act is because we know enough. Over the years, we've generated enough evidence to know what works. And we now need to take that which works to scale. And that's the message we're bringing here, really. And we need leadership to do that. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there for now.
We'll return to that, but let's get into the genesis of your project. First of all, the sheer lack of resources and structures that you found existing in Zimbabwe when you thought about this, and how you came across this idea, which we'll get into, of the friendship bench.
So Zimbabwe, like most African countries, does not have adequate resources for mental health care. In fact, in Africa, the focus tends to be on putting resources in institutions. So there's still a lot of institutionalization, which is a rather outdated way of trying to manage mental health. But even within those institutions where you have a lot of violation of basic rights of people, the care is not adequate. And as a psychiatrist in my own country in 2005, while I was working on my master's in public health field work, I was instructed to carry out a survey. Essentially what had happened in Zimbabwe was in 2005, the government had embarked on a cleanup operation which left hundreds of thousands of people homeless. And it was essentially against that background that I, as a psychiatrist working in the public health space, I was instructed to really find out what the magnitude of psychological morbidity was amongst my people. And the results showed extremely high rates of common mental disorders, which include depression, anxiety, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorders. And after these results were presented, I was then informed that we needed to do something. So being the only psychiatrist in that space, I was instructed to come up with a solution. But I was told there was no money. And I was also told that I would have to work with 14 grandmothers for the pilot. And I was not allowed to work with any of the clinic nurses or the doctors, none of the professionals. I was also told I could not use any of the buildings because they were occupied for other things. So in essence, through an iterative process with community grandmothers, together with a colleague, a clinical psychologist called Petra Mesu, we came up with this idea of delivering therapy on a bench. So the whole friendship bench really evolved over time. But I think what the beauty of the friendship bench, for me personally, at a very personal level, is that I learned a lot from the grandmothers. I learned as a psychiatrist how not to deliver therapy. And I learned the importance of, within the scientific space, within this space where we are often forced to work according to structures. I learned the importance of the human element, our empathy, active listening, and just being yourself and sharing your own lived experience as a therapist, something that we are not encouraged to do in training, but through the grandmothers, I realized the importance of sharing your own story. And these are some of the elements that have made the friendship bench really successful.
So by circumstance and necessity, you came across this project involving grandmothers and benches. Because you didn't have the physical spaces to actually do the work otherwise.
Yeah.
And now, 13 years later, you've proliferated around Zimbabwe. 60% of the country or so is covered by your programs. Tens of thousands of people seek counseling and therapy through sort of more than 500 grandmothers now. Yep. Let's talk about the grandmothers. Why grandmothers?
All right, so as I said, initially it was grandmothers because I was given 14 grandmothers for the pilot. And I thought, man, this is not going to work. This will never work, And these grandmothers are they don't have much education, They can read, they can use a phone, that's they can write. That's about it. And as I indicated earlier on, it was really through an iterative process of trying to find out from the grandmothers what they thought about mental health. Did they think there was a problem? And they acknowledged that there was a problem. But through that process, we also developed our own indigenous local lexicon, mental health lexicon, which really resonated with the grandmothers and the community as well. Again, that's one of the factors why I think Friendship Bench works. It does not rely on Western-derived concepts. Obviously, for research purposes, we do categorize those concepts into concepts that are understood in the Western world. For instance, when we use screening tools, we have to use some of the more standardized international screening tools like the PHQ, GAD-7 for generalized anxiety. That way we get to publish our work. But in essence, these grandmothers over the years have developed a language, a mental health lexicon, a whole lexicon of terms, that they use as they navigate through the sessions.
Could you give us some examples of those?
Yeah, so for instance, Friendship Bench is based on CBT principles, where you have, problem-solving therapy, behavior activation, activity scheduling, those kind of basic sort of features of CBT. It doesn't go into great depth of CBT. But the grandmothers, after going through their training in CBT, they came up with alternative terms. For instance, in the problem-solving therapy component, they prefer to use the word kuvura pfungwa, which literally means opening up the mind. When you use the term kuvura pfungwa in our setting, people immediately resonate with that. And then the process of going through the different elements of the PST, of problem-solving therapy rather, they come up with another term which they call kusimudzira, which literally means uplifting a person. And then thirdly, they come up with another alternative term which is really more to do with reinforcing solutions that are sort of found on the bench, and that is kusimbisa, which literally means to strengthen. And the third component, that kusimbisa component, actually can go on and on and on. So in my language, a word like kusimbisa you can add to that word to make it even stronger by saying kusimbisisa, and so the sessions simply add on to that, and so they've come up with these amazing terms, but not only terms related to the process, but also terms related to the diagnosis of the conditions themselves. For instance, depression would be described as kufungisisa, which literally means excessive thinking. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, would be described as kufungisisa kwenjodzi, which literally means excessive thinking due to a traumatic event. So we do away with all these Western concepts, and this is all due to the grandmother's own sort of intuitive feel about what would work and what will the community resonate with. Yeah.
I want to return to the idea of these Western concepts, but could you give us a bit more of a kind of, how does this work? So say we're in a random village in Zimbabwe, and there's a bench, and there's a grandmother, and a patient comes. What does the process look like? What happens if the grandmother, say, feels that the patient needs other kinds of help?
Yeah.
Are there systems in place to escalate that? How does this work?
Great, that's a great question. Maybe let me start off with the training.
Right.
So grandmothers, firstly we have an assessment of community grandmothers based on very basic core competencies. You have to be able to read and write, and you have to be able to use a phone, period. If you can do any of those things, then you qualify to be trained as a Friendship Bench grandmother. And the training is 1 month. Which is more like in a classroom type training. But after that, we have a lot of role playing, and we have a lot of very practical skills training within the community, within the clinics, which also involves our team audio recording and video recording the sessions. And we use that as a way of actually teaching the grandmothers how to use empathy, how to use active listening as a skill, how to use nonverbal communication as a skill within therapy, how to structure therapy. And then we also encourage our grandmothers to use their own personal lived experiences. When we first started, we didn't think lived experiences were important, but the grandmothers simply integrated that on their own, and we've realized over the years that it's an important aspect of therapy. So those lived experiences become the foundation of the CBT therapy that they then use to facilitate treatment. So what actually happens on the bench? Normally, people are referred to the bench from different settings, from local clinics, from the police station, from schools, and lately we get a lot of self-referrals. The first thing that happens on the bench is the grandmother invites the client, and the first thing that they normally would say is, "I'm here to help you. Would you like to share your story with me?" During the process of sharing that story, the grandmother is also asking questions based on a set of validated screening tools. And through those screening tools, the grandmother is then able to assess during that storytelling whether a client is a case or not. Sometimes people come to the bench just to talk because they've gone through a bad day. Not everyone who has experienced a bad day meets a DSM-5 diagnosis. So using the screening tools, the grandmothers are then able to say, this is actually a case, or this is a red flag, this person is suicidal, I need to move on to stage B of my intervention. I need to call my supervisor because this case actually requires further input. And what we've done over the years is grandmothers who've been running Friendship Bench for 4 or 5 years automatically are promoted to become peer supervisors. They then supervise the grandmothers who are just starting. So a grandmother who's just starting who has a problem will go to a peer grandmother supervisor. If the peer grandmother supervisor can't manage, she then goes on to a supervisor for the peer grandmothers. So that's how it works, because we try to use the psychiatrists and the clinical psychologists as less as possible because we don't have enough of them. So this is the whole model of task shifting or collaborative care models, as it's commonly called.
So at the risk of sounding churlish, why not grandfathers? And a corollary question, in sort of the decade plus that you've been doing this Friendship Bench project, has there been a gender division in terms of the patients you're seeing? Is it more women, less women, fewer women, or is it sort of roughly the same? Or
yeah. So let me start off with your last question. There are generally more women attending Friendship Bench because the Friendship Benches are, of course it's changing now, the Friendship Benches are situated close to primary healthcare facilities, and if you look at the data across sub-Saharan Africa, primary healthcare facilities are frequented more often by women than men. We are now sort of incorporating other components to the Friendship Bench, like digital platforms, which are more comfortable for men, which are more comfortable for young people as well. For instance, a young person will come to the bench for just one session, and they then decide all the subsequent sessions they want to via their phone. And we're seeing that as an alternative way of actually reaching out to young people. For men, we have programs which are more embedded within the communities, close to places where men hang out, pubs and things like that. So we have to be strategic in terms of where we place the benches. And then coming on to your first question about why grandmothers and not grandfathers, we actually did try working with grandfathers, but the reality is that grandfathers tend to be very prescriptive, and the Friendship Bench is not about being prescriptive. The Friendship Bench is about creating space, and grandfathers we find sometimes struggle immensely with empathy. They struggle with active listening. One of the things that we do on the bench is the grandmothers encourage the client to list the challenges that the client is facing. And it's not up to the grandmother to tell the client what they need to do. It's up to the client to come up with a solution. Grandfathers tend to tell the client, so we've listed these problems. I think you should be focusing on this problem. That's what a grandfather would typically do, whereas grandmothers somehow have that restraint. They give the client space, and the more space you give a client, the more therapeutic the whole process. I strongly believe that every human being inherently has the capacity to problem solve. And our responsibility is to empower that person so that they can problem solve on their own.
Right.
And that's what we do on the Friendship Bench. And this is what we found consistently, whether you're in Malawi, in Zanzibar, in New York City, where we're running Friendship Bench, it's the same. It's all rooted in these lived experiences and providing space.
Right. I
you
mean,
know?
Exactly. I mean, you mentioned earlier that part of the process involved doing away with certain Western understandings, but at the same time, as you just said, there is a profound universality about what this at the heart of this project.
Yeah.
And I think that gets us into talking about its scalability. Can you talk a bit about the way it's expanded elsewhere? And I mean, for example, I write a lot about refugees, and given the scale of the humanitarian crisis there, the traumas of populations elsewhere, is this a kind of thing that could end up in refugee camps, used in other places like that? Talk a bit about the scalability, and then afterwards I'd love to get to questions as well.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why, together with United for Global Mental Health, we're here at Davos, is because we strongly believe that the Friendship Bench is a good example of a simple, cost-effective program that can be scaled up. And the process of scaling a program really consists of three key components. Firstly, you want to make sure that it's evidence-based, and the Friendship Bench is rooted in evidence. We have close to 50 publications, which include randomized clinical trials. The gold standard for answering the question whether something is evidence-based is the randomized clinical trial, which we have, and we also have replicated it outside of the setting where it was tested, Zimbabwe. So we're replicating it in rural areas. It's gone to Malawi, Zanzibar, Botswana, and also in New York City, where it's doing extremely well. I recently got an email just the other day from the team in New York saying they've managed to reach out to 81,000 people in the last year alone.
This is in the Bronx?
In the Bronx, through Friendship Benches. So it's very universal. And I think with that evidence, it's working in Africa, it's working in New York City, and it's simple, it's cheap, it can be replicated. I think we are ready to take this to scale, and we are ready to take similar programs to scale. I think for a long time in the global mental health community, we've been focusing a lot on generating the evidence, generating the evidence to show that programs work. We have a bunch of programs out there that really work. What we're saying this year in Davos is that we need to now take these things to scale, and we need leadership. We need support from policymakers, from business leaders, world leaders, to truly take these programs to scale, because mental health is truly a crisis that we are facing as a global community.
On that note, I'd love to take questions. The lady in the back.
Hello, I'm Deborah Whitman from AARP. We represent 37 million people over age 50 in the United States. And we have a program called Experience Corps that puts older adults into schools to help students learn to read. And while the students are improved in their reading, what's even more special is the health of the older adults who are providing that. We've seen even with brain scans that their health has improved. And so can you talk to me about the effect on the grandmothers of having this purpose and this status and this ability to help their community?
Great. We were actually talking about that, weren't we? Yeah, we were. So to be quite honest, Ruth and I, she's the clinical psychologist in the team, we were very concerned about the well-being of the grandmothers, when this program started expanding, and we're like, these poor grandmothers, they're probably burnt out, and they're probably going to end up all being depressed and suicidal themselves, And so Ruth focused on that particular question for her PhD to really find out how the grandmothers were doing, and we carried out a survey of all the grandmothers who are involved in Friendship Bench, and we compared that data with, with variables linked to the community. And the surprising thing is these grandmothers are extremely resilient in terms of prevalence of common mental disorders, PTSD, and all sorts of challenges that are common in our community. They have extremely low rates. For instance, the rate of common mental disorders, which includes depression and anxiety disorders, was around 6%, whereas in the general population, it's about 30%. We found the same for PTSD, and we also found the same for quality of life. But these are elderly people. A lot of them are suffering from chronic conditions. You know, you wouldn't expect them to have a better quality of life than somebody who's out there who's much younger. And so we went deeper to explore why, what was it? And through focus group discussions with the grandmothers, we found that they actually found that this gave them a purpose, you know, to exist in life. You know, it gave them that meaning that they were in a community and they were contributing towards making their community grow. Because the grandmothers that we recruit normally live in the very communities where the benches are. So they are familiar with the dynamics of that community, and so they are really eager to help communities. So in essence, our findings show that this is actually therapeutic not only for the clients sitting on the bench, but also for the grandmothers. And that's why we carry on working with grandmothers.
That's beautiful. Any more questions? The lady in the back and then in the front afterwards.
Thank you so much. This is so inspiring. I'm curious about, is there any money exchanged in here? Both in terms of the person who's receiving the therapy, because often, as we know, if you pay for something, you value it more. And then also for the grandmothers who are giving up their time and maybe not working in the homes or other places that they might be working.
No, there's no exchange of money. It's free. It's a public health program that we provide for free. Some of the grandmothers who work within health facilities do get an allowance, you know, for transport and things like that. When we run studies within the Friendship Bench, we are legally obliged to pay what we call a reimbursement for research participants, you know, according to the Research Council of Zimbabwe and in all the other places we've been, which is normal. But otherwise, they don't get paid. And as I said, they find it rewarding, you know.
In the front, hi.
Hi, my name is Francis.
Okay. I can hear you.
All right. Hi, my name is Francis Rafal. I'm a global shaper from Vienna. I really love what you're doing. 2 days ago, I learned at a session that grandfathers don't have any effect on how old a child becomes, whereas grandmothers have an effect on how children become. So grandfathers are useless in that case. And now I learned that grandfathers aren't being used for that because they are not willing to listen better or something. I feel like, okay, maybe I will become useless someday. So I'm still young, but maybe isn't there a possibility to like teach grandfathers to listen better instead of mansplaining or explaining that? Or is this just taking up too much energy?
That's a very good question. We haven't completely discarded the grandfathers. we work with them because I think they have a role to play. So one of the things that we are currently looking into is, you know, things like physical exercises, more sort of structured activity, which is very practical, you know, particularly for young people. You know, we've got a program currently running, you know, the Youth Friendship Bench, which is focusing on young people living with HIV. And I see the grandfathers playing an important role there because a lot of these young people have lost their parents through HIV, and these grandfathers can play a very powerful role. I think it's normal, you know, that that the grandfather will react the way he does, and the grandmother reacts the way she does, and we just have to find a way of using both their strengths, you know, to get the best results.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question.
Thank you. Really inspiring session. Thank you so much. Just a quick question, really, about the location of benches. So,
I beg your pardon?
About the location of benches. So, you know, I'm listening. I'm from the UK. It really rains a lot in the UK. I'm thinking there's a barrier. But I'm also wondering whether you've experienced any kind of stigma with, you know, unfortunately, there is still something of a stigma attached to depression. And I wonder whether you have to be careful about the location of benches, or whether you have any evidence of people being reluctant to be seen, and you have to place the benches in a more private setting.
So, thank you. That's a good question. Being the psychiatrist that I am, with, you know, this perception of confidentiality, when we first started friendship benches, we had them in discrete locations. And being the psychiatrist that I am, when we first started, we even called it the mental health bench. People didn't come to the mental health bench. You know, we changed the name, called it the friendship bench. People came to the friendship bench. They even wanted the bench to be in the open. You know, so I think, as I indicated in our panel discussion the other day, language is very important. What you call something is very important. These are small things that we never take seriously, but they are so powerful. They can make or break a program. I think if we had carried on with the name mental health program, the friendship bench would not be existing today. It would have died, you know. So that's the power of the name. Coming on to London, I am very determined to start something similar in London, you know, and we've been discussing with friends and colleagues through the London School, you know, and others. And I think there's an opportunity, you know, you can have benches in tube stations. There are so many places where you can have benches, and if it's a friendship bench, I strongly believe that even in the London underground, there'll be no stigma. That's my hypothesis. We'll test it one of these days.
Well, I look forward to that. I think we're out of time, unfortunately, but join me in thanking Dr. Chibanda for
Thank you.
Such an inspiring and wonderful project. And if you haven't yet, go sit on the friendship bench.
Thanks.
Thank you again.